Hi everyone, it's Lauren Carpenter here at FantasyPros. Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. And today we're going to be talking about the top 10 quarterbacks from our FantasyPros expert consensus rankings. Number 10, Tom Brady. There may have been reason to doubt Brady's ability to produce at an elite level moving from New England to Tampa Bay last year, but as usual, he proved all the doubters wrong. We've all heard by now that Brady didn't learn Bruce Arians' playbook until mid-year. From weeks 1 through 9, Brady averaged a respectable 19.95 fantasy points per game. From weeks 10 through 17, he averaged 24.34 points per game, just behind Aaron Rodgers and Lamar Jackson. With every notable offensive piece returning and fresh off of a Super Bowl win, Brady should again be in line for another excellent season, both real and in fantasy. Number 9, Jalen Hurts. Hurts had his ups and downs in his brief stint as a starter last season, but overall, he was electric, finishing as the number 7 quarterback in fantasy from the time he took over the starting job for good in Week 14. He'll have a new head coach in Nick Sirianni with a new playbook to learn, and his offensive line could still use plenty of work. But the addition of Devonta Smith, as well as the high floor he offers because of his rushing ability, means he should be drafted as a top 10 option. Even if you're not completely sold on him, someone in your league will be, so you'll need to pull the trigger early if you want him on your team this season. Number 8, Justin Herbert. Herbert wasn't expected to take over as the starting QB in Week 2, but when he stepped in, he showed that the moment and the league were not too big for him. He set a rookie record for passing touchdowns with 31, threw just 10 interceptions, and crossed 4,300 yards on his way to Rookie of the Year honors. A new coaching staff likely won't hurt Herbert's outlook either, as offensive coordinator Joe Lombardi is the former quarterbacks coach for the Saints. With Rashawn Slater helping to bolster the offensive line, the sky is the limit for Herbert as he enters his second year in the league. Number 7, Aaron Rodgers. Rodgers threw a ridiculous 48 touchdown passes with a mere 5 interceptions en route to his MVP season last year. Although his skill was never in question, it was hard to see it coming from a fantasy perspective, given that he had thrown for 51 touchdowns combined over the previous 2 years and had gotten little help from the front office. His success in 2020 would certainly put him in consideration for a top 5 ranking at the position, but as everyone knows, there is an enormous amount of uncertainty regarding whether Rodgers will play and if he does, where that will be. He's still worth drafting as the 7th quarterback off the board, but until his situation is settled, it's probably worth drafting a backup option, even in a single QB league. Number 6, Russell Wilson. The let Russ cook narrative was on full display in the first half of the season last year as Wilson attempted 297 passes and threw for over 2,500 yards and 28 touchdowns. In the second half, however, Wilson dropped to 261 pass attempts, under 1,700 yards passing, and just 12 passing touchdowns. Unfortunately, there's been more talk of Seattle pounding the run yet again, which led to Wilson being a bit disgruntled and trade rumors swirling. Forget the first half version we saw last year. Wilson is likely to be closer to the extremely solid, but perhaps a tier below the elite fantasy quarterback we've seen for several years. Number 5, Dak Prescott. Prescott was building on his breakout 2019 campaign when a gruesome ankle injury ended his 2020 season in the Cowboys' 5th game. With his health looking promising and with CeeDee Lamb's breakout status well established, there's every reason to buy into Prescott from a fantasy standpoint once again. The Cowboys' defense shouldn't be significantly improved from what we saw last year, which means that Dallas's offense will again need to put up big point totals to compete. It's the perfect storm for someone like Prescott who combines the beauty of a high floor with an enormously high ceiling. Number 4, Lamar Jackson. Most fantasy managers expected significant regression from Jackson last year, and they certainly got it, especially early on. Through Week 11, Jackson averaged just 20.3 fantasy points per game, 12th most among quarterbacks. But from that point on, he averaged 27.7 fantasy points per game, most in the league. A large part of his success later in the year was the increase in his rushing yardage, as he went from averaging just 57.5 rushing yards per game in the first 11 weeks to 86 rushing yards per game over his final 5 contests. Jackson will likely continue to rely on his legs plenty, but he'll also have new weapons, including Rashad Bateman and Sammy Watkins. Add it all together, and Jackson should be absolutely safe with the upside to finish as the number 1 quarterback overall again if everything breaks perfectly. Number 3, Kyler Murray. Through the first 10 weeks, Murray was on a different level in terms of fantasy production, putting up 30.16 fantasy points per game and ranking as the number 1 quarterback in the game. His rushing production in particular was practically silly, as he was basically the Cardinals' goal line back with 10 touchdowns through the team's first 9 games. But after a Week 11 shoulder injury, he just wasn't the same. His rushing yards and carry averages plummeted, and he scored just 1 rushing touchdown over his final 7 games. There's so much upside with Murray, and the Cardinals only added to his weapons when they drafted Rondale Moore. But Murray's frame and involvement as a rusher will likely lead to an increased risk of injury, so fantasy managers need to know that going in. Number 2, Josh Allen. With the addition of Stephon Diggs and some natural maturation, many fantasy managers expected Allen to take a step up from a fantasy standpoint, but no one could have predicted that he'd end the year as the number 1 quarterback. He threw for more than 4,500 yards, up from 3,082, and 37 touchdown passes, up from 20, while maintaining his role as the goal line back with 8 rushing touchdowns. Literally everything trended up, including his 69.2% completion percentage and 6.5% touchdown rate. The league may adjust to Allen a bit, as we saw in his last 2 playoff games, but with Diggs there, it's almost impossible to see Allen finishing worse than a top 5 QB. He is deservedly the second quarterback off the board. Number 1, Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes is the epitome of not overthinking things. He hasn't finished as the number 1 quarterback in either of the past 2 seasons, and Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson are all explosive playmakers. But absent a catastrophic injury, there's just almost no plausible path to Mahomes being a disappointment. He has few flaws in his game, dynamic offensive skill players at his disposal, and a Hall of Fame coach running a perfect offense. He's probably the only fantasy quarterback in the game that carries with him 0 question marks. He's not quite in a tier unto himself, but he should be the surefire first signal caller off the board in any fantasy league. And that's all we have for our top 10 quarterbacks from our Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings, and thank you again for watching our YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us at Fantasy Pros on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter so you don't miss out on any of the content that we'll be pumping out all year long.